Well, it sure is Monday out there, isn't it? I find myself, as I really often do year to year, a bit of a malaise after Easter. Easter is always this build up, this excitement, this hope and expectation. And yesterday was a very good Easter. It was unique. But there's still this, this letdown after. And so today I'm kind of fighting that. And I think I mentioned I found some weights, some heavy things to move around in my basement. So that did help for sure this morning, but I still find myself in a bit of a funk. And so I was thinking through this big idea of exile still, and maybe we'll shift gears soon away from exile and quarantine. I don't know if that's scratching an itch or not. But I was thinking about, what did exile mean to the people of God? What did it mean to Israel in a big picture sense? We've talked some about some of the small things, but there are three. So eventually we get along to Jesus, and then after Jesus we come to Paul, and Paul is coming from a place where the exiles eventually came home, but they didn't really come home, and so Rome was still there. They didn't quite have the autonomy that they wanted, and so Paul writes about all this, and basically he looks back at all the expectations and the hopes of the people of Israel, and they really fall into three categories. The first is that there will be land, so they will have this space, and so we see this unfolding throughout the story of the Exodus. We see even before that in Abraham, and God promises him this is the land. And then Moses leads the people from Egypt, and God promises them this will be your land, and so therefore go take it. And they have all these wars, and so the land was deeply integrated with their identity, right? And then there was a promise of a king. And so if you remember, this is one of those unique passages, I think, but basically God didn't want to give them a king, and the whole story seems to be that God wanted to continue with judges, and that God wanted to continue to be their ruler, but the people wanted to be like everyone else, so they called out for a king. God eventually gave them a king, and so now they have the land and a king, and these things start to really define their identity. And then they have King Saul, then King David, and then King David's son Solomon built a temple, and the temple was fantastic. I mean, it was covered in gold and silver, all this amazing stuff, and that's where they would come to do their worship and their sacrifice. And so the people of God were defined by these three main focuses, inflection points. They're defined by these three main things, right? So land, a king, and a temple. And these things all help them to see who they are and to understand who God has made them to be. Then, all at once, Babylon comes in and knocks all that out from underneath them. The people are taken away from the land. The king is removed from any kind of significant power. And the temple is destroyed, and all the rich stuff is taken away. And so suddenly, the people of God had this real crisis of identity, right? They could either be a people that were defined based on something else, or they could not be a people anymore because they didn't have the three things that identified them before. They didn't have the three markers of their identity, right? And so we see in this exile a redefinition of the people beginning to understand who they really are and what their identity is based on. And I was thinking about the parallels to our current quarantine, and I think I've touched on this a little bit in some of these videos, but But for us as American Christians, a lot of times we identify ourselves by similar types of traits, right? We identify ourselves by the temple. And so we identify ourselves by where we go to worship on Sundays. And so I've fought sometimes a futile battle against the idea that we come to church on Sundays. I believe that church is us. We are the church. We come to worship. And maybe we come to do that at a church building, but it's a building that is owned by the church, not the church itself. And so anywhere we gather can be church. So our family units of 5 or 6 or 4 or 3 or 2 or 1, if we are gathering in the Spirit, we are gathered in truth, and we are the church at that point. And so for a lot of us as Christians, we define ourselves by the temple, right? Or we've defined ourselves by king, and some of us that means the way we vote, or the way that we interact with politics, or the way that we believe that rulers are going to do the things that are in our best interest, or that are best for us. And that's a whole conversation that I'm not prepared to do in the next 3 or 4 minutes. But in my opinion, that is not what we ought to base our identity as Christians on. It should not be based on who we voted for, or whether they are, whether we believe that they are doing the things that God has intended them to do. Because there's disagreement among Christians, and the Bible doesn't clearly say this party good, that party bad, this politician good, that politician bad. So we live in this gray in that, and so that's not a trustworthy thing to define our identity on. And then so we've lost the temple, we've lost the ability to use kings to define ourselves. And in some ways, I think about the land, and I think about the land is kind of the synonym for autonomy, right? We look back. I was even I mentioned this before. I had a dream that I shook somebody's hand, and it was a kind of a striking dream, because I was like, oh, it's so nice to shake someone's hand, and right now there's this real feeling of lack of autonomy in that I can't do what I want. And so for us as American Christians, most of us have never experienced this lack of autonomy. None of us we've never experienced, unless we've been a prisoner somewhere. And I don't think many of the people that are watching, many of the 10 people that watch my videos were prisoners anywhere. And so none of us have ever lacked that autonomy. And so we are in this crisis of identity, right? All these things that seemingly used to prop up and to define us, the things of worship on Sundays seem to define us as Christians. The political conversation has for a long time defined us as Christians, but it seems a little less clear in 2020. And our autonomy has oftentimes, our ability to do as Christians whatever we want to do, has defined us, and suddenly it seems like those things are taken away. So the question is, what did Israel realize really defined them, or true Israel, what did they realize defined them? And us as Christians, what do we realize defines us? And it, to me, when you cut through all of it, we come to a place in the New Testament where Jesus is true Israel. Jesus is the only true Israel. And so Jesus defined himself by his relationship to God, Yahweh God, and he did that by calling him God Father, Yahweh the Father. And so suddenly, Jesus redefined all of the definitions of identity. Suddenly it wasn't about whether you had autonomy to worship. You didn't need that. It wasn't about whether you could go to the temple to make a sacrifice. You didn't need that. It wasn't about whether you had the land or the king or any of that. You didn't need any of that, because God was the Father regardless of where you were. God was the Father regardless of where you worshiped. Worship in spirit and in truth, right? God was the Father regardless of who sat on the throne, because God was still the Father. And so Jesus, true Israel, gives us a template for Christians in 2020 and how we define ourselves. We have this brilliant moment of clarity, I think. We have this opportunity to redefine ourselves, to say, you know what, I love to worship, but if worship defines my identity, then I've got to reevaluate that. I've got to ask myself, if this can be so easily taken away, if I can lose this so quickly, Is that the life God intended for me? And we have to ask ourselves, if politics really define us as Christians, then what do we do with Christians who disagree with us? Are they not part of the same family of God? And if our autonomy is what defines us, then what do we do with the early church who had no autonomy? They couldn't do any of this stuff we do because they were outlawed. They would be murdered if they did that. And so they couldn't. But they maintained their identity. And so if you're thinking about one thing today, I want you to think about this. Our identity is in our relationship to God the Father, to Jesus Christ, to the Holy Spirit. Our identity begins there. The next step of that is that we are brothers and sisters knowing that same Father. We are brothers and sisters following that same Jesus. We're brothers and sisters invested by that same Holy Spirit. So those two foci now are our new identity. We don't have to do the things that we think we have to do. We are able to relate to those things in creative and wonderful new ways. Paul wrote letters, and sometimes those letters are super long, like Romans, and they're really hard to read all at once, right? And sometimes those letters are a little harsh, like Corinthians or Galatians. Sometimes those letters are super kind, like Philippians, I think. And sometimes they're letters of rebuke, like Philemon. And so we have a new template, a new way of being. And so the question, I think, for us is, will we be like Israel, who in this moment of exile, they could have reevaluated themselves. They could have asked these hard questions and said, what is my identity based on? And when they came back to the land, they could have gotten back on track. They could have rediscovered the way that they really should have been in relationship to Yahweh. Instead, they came back and they looked for a king again. They looked for the land again, and they looked for a temple again, and they fell short. For us, maybe this is an opportunity to say, I want my life to be built around following Jesus. I want my life to be built, and there's nothing any church can do that can prevent me from doing that. There's nothing any government can do to prevent me from doing that. There's nothing any lack of autonomy. I could do this in a prison cell just like Paul did. And that is one of the things I've been thinking about in this exile. We have a great opportunity, and that's to reevaluate how we relate to God. And so the question is, will we take this opportunity to do that, or will we just pine for the days of normalcy? Will we just pine for the days that we thought that things were good? Because maybe if we redefine it, when we come back, things can be better than they ever were. Hope you're doing well today. Hope you break out of your post-Monday Easter funk. Hope I do too. I've got some good coffee and some pretzels with peanut butter in them for lunch, so that hopefully should help. Thanks for being here, wherever you are, whenever you are. See ya.